Warning: this episode contains the use of a word that is considered highly offensive in the modern day, but is very important in its purely historical context of this story, and will not be used in a derogatory fashion. A timestamp will be in the description should you wish not to hear the word, which will only occur once in this video, with a further warning coming just beforehand. One of the most daring and ambitious air operations of the whole Second World War. 3 important points of German infrastructure all hit on the same night. Could it be done? More importantly, how could they do it? Well, put on your flight goggles and kick back with a cold one and find out, because today, Descent into Darkness explores Operation Chastise, the Dam Busters Raid. Background. It should come as little surprise these days when I tell you that in 1943 Great Britain was deeply involved in a slight contretemps with Nazi Germany and their singular gonaded leader Adolf Hitler. But despite the Allies making huge gains in the air and in North Africa, Germany was still able to push out healthy production numbers for their war machine. This was something the British found rather objectionable, and so resolved to put the kibosh on their large manufacturing and heavy industry base. The most fruitful of these was the Ruhr Valley, an area in the west of Germany which lies not too far from the Dutch border, and boasted large coal deposits. On top of this, the Ruhr River and its many tributaries were perfect for damming and utilising the hydroelectric power, and then all that cleared land that was no longer underwater was also prime fertile agricultural land. The previous year, the British had identified 3 important dams that, if destroyed, would cause widespread devastation to the Ruhr industries. These dams were named after the rivers they held back: the Eder, Möhne, and Sorpe. The Genius. The USA is noted for having a glut of absolute legends in their small arms manufacturing that supplied several great designs for the Second World War, such as the venerable John Browning and John Garand, even though he was a Canadian, and other slightly lesser known faces like Douglas Pedersen. The British were a little thin on the ground in that department. However, when it came to airdropped ordnance, we did have something of an ace in the hole. Step forward and take a bow. Barnes Neville Wallace, a man who would go on to create 3 different kinds of bombs, as well as a few other innovations. The man was a complete engineering powerhouse. He understood physics in a way that none could compare. Born on the 26th of September 1887 in Ripley, Derbyshire, Wallace's engineering education had begun all the way back in 1905, when he joined the Thames Engineering Works in Blackheath, South London, at the age of 17 for his apprenticeship, later transferring to another firm, J. Samuel White Shipbuilders, on the Isle of Wight off Portsmouth. In 1913, the chance to change specialism from ships to aircraft came up with the Vickers Company, which later merged with Armstrong to form Armstrong Vickers. Very imaginative. A government-owned company that was part of the British Aircraft Corporation. One of his first innovations came in the 1930s with the development of the so-called geodetic frame, a lightweight metal frame for aircraft shaped like a web of diamond shapes. This provided a very strong modular system that could be made into any shape or form for aircraft. A forerunner of this system was utilised in experimental airships, the R-80 and R-100, but at this stage still not a true geodetic frame. However, when it came to the next iteration, the ill-fated R-101, despite Wallace leading the design team, a much more conventional frame construction was selected for that craft. Although I should point out that the loss of the R-101 was nothing to do with Wallace's contributions to the design, which was perfectly sound. The geodetic construction method would go on to be used for many metal-framed planes going forward, with Wallace's input, such as the Wellesley, Wellington and Windsor medium bombers. I guess Vickers had a thing about the letter W. At the outbreak of the war, Wallace noted the overall ineffectiveness of high-level area bombing, what we would today know as carpet bombing, and penned a paper to the War Department entitled A Note on a Method of Attacking the Axis Powers, in which he said, quote, "If their destruction or paralysis can be accomplished, they offer a means of rendering the enemy utterly incapable of continuing to prosecute the war." Wallace had even begun to envisage what would eventually become the weapon of choice for today's video, as he begun another paper entitled Spherical Bomb, Surface Torpedo, in April of 1942, and this was not his first paper on the topic. He noted how aircraft-launched conventional torpedoes would not work against ships and static targets, as anti-torpedo and submarine nets would render them impotent. Therefore, a new weapon which could skim or bounce across the surface of the water would be better for the job, bypassing any such countermeasures. When the idea for Operation Chastise was mooted, Wallace was straight to the fore. But initially, he proposed the use of an exceedingly large conventional bomb that could penetrate the ground surface by several feet before detonating. This concept was known as an earthquake bomb, the idea being that a subsurface burst would undermine the target structure to the point of collapse. However, such a device would require tremendous weight, most of it being dedicated to a dense nose cap that used pure inertia to punch deep into the ground. He calculated a total weight of around 10 long tons. At the time, no aircraft existed that could carry such a large weapon. Although ever helpful, Wallace did suggest designing a 6-engined heavy bomber that would be called the Victory, but this never got beyond the concept stage. The earthquake bomb idea would not completely die, but more on that later. No, another method would have to be sought. But our intrepid hero was more than up to the task. Upkeep. The weapon that Wallace came up with for the operation, codenamed Upkeep, was a revolution in conventional bombs. The idea came about from his studies of water. He realized that if an explosive charge is placed next to a stone or brick structure underwater, the pressure wave created by the explosives formed a cavitation bubble in the water that then immediately collapsed, meaning, depending on scale, that many tons of water will rush in to fill this void. Not only that, but the incompressible nature of liquid means that as well as the damage caused by the charge itself, the water behind it helps direct much more of the energy towards the solid object. Then the collapsing cavitation bubble forces a massive amount of water to slam against the object, developing even more damage. The result? You did not need a huge bomb to bring down a dam, just a strategically placed one. But how did you achieve this? High-level bombing was far too inaccurate to land a charge right up against the wall of a dam underwater, and low-level bombing suffers from pretty much the same problem, plus anti-aircraft batteries have a nice large lumbering target to shoot at. There had to be a better way. The perfect solution came from his observation playing with marbles. Yes, those small glass balls with the pretty patterns inside, loved by kids the world over in days gone by, would provide the answer to the problem. Wallace noted that, just like skipping stones on a lake, if the right kind of force is imparted onto a spherical object, it too will skip across the surface of the water. Wallace quickly built himself a rig out of a children's catapult and a tin bathtub, and began experimenting with methods. Variables such as speed, angle of attack, different directions of spin, and distance from target were all painstakingly recorded. He discovered that if a backspin is imparted on the marble, the skip will be predictable and consistent. But the more important discovery that his rig would unearth, he found that the backspun marble, once it hit the other end of the bathtub, as it sank, it would hug the wall of the tub. This was Wallace's true eureka moment. How fitting that this one too would involve a bathtub. If he could design a bomb that could be spun backwards and released at the optimum height, speed, and distance, the same effect could be achieved, meaning that an explosive payload could be delivered right up to the exact place where it needed to be, and then it would be a simple case of using a depth charge fuse to detonate the payload to breach the dam at its base, where a breach would be most effective. Wallace presented his findings to RAF Bomber Command. Understandably, they were highly skeptical at first. A bouncing bomb? Surely not. There is no way that could work. But Wallace was certain that it could, if Bomber Harris's flyboys could hold their nerve and not hesitate at the critical moment. He decided that the best proof of concept was to make a scale model for demonstration, and so, in a field not far from Watford, a 1/50th scale model of the Möhne Dam was built. At this stage, the experiment was purely to show the explosive damage of such a weapon rather than the delivery method. A tiny charge of the explosive Torpex was placed beside the model wall, which was built of concrete, just like the real thing, which was then exploded, and, wouldn't you know it, it breached the concrete wall. So the proof of concept was sound. But the only aircraft that could achieve such a mission, having enough range and survivability to tank damage and still return home, was the Avro Lancaster, an absolute behemoth and icon of Britain's war effort. The shape of the weapon that Wallace decided upon looked rather like an oil barrel, or similar to a depth charge, as that's essentially what it was. If it was dropped correctly, it would skip on its side rather than end over end. Wallace designed a very simple rig that held the bomb underneath the aircraft's fuselage that was fitted with a belt drive from a small electric motor that would give the bomb its backspin of 500 RPM. The rig was fixed rather than deployable, so it would cause extra drag resistance to the Lancaster, decreasing its fuel efficiency slightly. Therefore, they would need all unnecessary equipment stripped out to eke out as much range of the bomber's fuel tank as possible to make sure the planes could make the round trip. But all of this would be far easier said than done. Destroying those dams would require the bombing run to be perfect. The speed, height, and direction had to be precise, otherwise it wouldn't work. Too fast and the bomb would either disintegrate on impact with the water or bounce right over the target. If the release was too late, same overshooting problem. Too early, and it wouldn't have the legs to get to the dam. But Barnes Wallis had a solution for this as well. He designed a simple rig of 2 spotlights that intersected at the exact distance to the surface of the water, so the bomb aimer, laying on his stomach, could watch for these 2 lamps and advise the pilot on corrections. For the perfect distance to the target, a simple wooden peep device was created that was to be held up to the eyes of the bomb aimer. The distance to the 2 towers of the dam were a known quantity, and so, when they both appeared in the viewfinder, that was the time to release. It was simple, and it was ingenious. Upkeep needed to be dropped at a height of only 60 feet from the water, and at an airspeed of 240 miles per hour. So, they had the weapon and the means of delivery, but there was still one more problem. All 3 dams sat in valleys, leaving little room to maneuver, and with anti-aircraft defences observed by reconnaissance planes around the dams, the air crews would perhaps only get one go at their target only. This would require nothing but the very best pilots and crews. The entirety of the mission would come down to sheer grit, flawless coordination, and zero hesitation. Luckily, the county of Lincolnshire, known as Bomber County due to its large number of bomber bases, hosted such a group of men. 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters. Although 617 Squadron would obviously not gain their legendary moniker until after the operation, they were something of a special breed. Based at RAF Scampton outside of Lincoln, 617 were full of the finest, most experienced aircrews in the country. The commander of 617 was Indian-born Brit, Wing Commander Guy Penrose Gibson, DSO and Bar, and DFC and Bar. A man short on stature, but a giant of courage, instilling a calm yet daring professionalism amongst his subordinates. And I think it is at this moment that we must address an elephant in the room when it comes to this story. And here comes the further warning I alluded to at the start of the video. I have put a timestamp below so you can skip forward a few seconds should you wish to avoid it, which you should do now. But just know that if you choose not to avoid it and then get offended, you had your choice. Okay, so Guy Gibson had a black Labrador that quickly became the mascot for the whole squadron and was well loved all around the base. And his name was Nigger, a very common name for a black dog at that time. Now, yes, I know that isn't a word that we like to use these days, but please realize I'm not being derogatory, but that was simply the dog's name. I think I know my audience is mature enough to know the difference. But anyway, welcome back, and don't worry, that's the only time you'll have to skip. On with the rest of the story. The testing for the new weapon began firstly as a proof of concept with a non-explosive dummy. An intense series of practice flights were undertaken using a disused dam in Wales, the Möhne Dam in the Elan Valley, a remote area of Wales away from prying eyes. This same dam would also be used for a live fire exercise with the new bomb. The test on the 24th of July 1942 was a resounding success, with the dam being breached using only 279 pounds, or 127 kilos of explosive filler. The remnants of the dam are still there to this day. It was calculated that the total weight of explosive charge needed to reliably breach a large dam was 7,500 pounds, or 3,400 kilos of Torpex, which should be detonated at a depth of 30 feet, or 9.1 meters. Gibson insisted to his superiors that his Lancasters be fitted with VHF radios, something which normally were only fitted to fighters, but these allowed Gibson and his other officers to liaise with each other and direct the order of attack, which was found to be much more helpful, having local command making decisions based on the developing situation. Even more practice runs were undertaken with practice upkeep dummies at various places around Britain to refine the correct procedure. The most notable of these were at Reculver in Kent, Isbrook Reservoir in Rutland, Abberton Reservoir near Colchester, and Derwent Reservoir in the Peak District. A lot of these test runs were observed by Wallace himself, who kept meticulous observations and offered feedback where he thought necessary, adjusting the design and instructions as he saw fit. Some final testing was undertaken in late April of 1943, and then on the 13th of May, RAF Scampton took delivery of the live upkeep bombs to be used on the raid. 2 days later, Wallace and Gibson held a meeting with the other senior officers of the flight, who would be leading the attacks. The briefing was the final instructions to the commanders before the operation. The men knew the score. They had had it incessantly drilled into them from day one of training for this moment. Now it was time to put it all into practice and give it a go. The date for the operation was slated for the night of the 16th and 17th of May 1943. Operation Chastise. As 0 hour approached, the atmosphere was tense. Equipment was meticulously checked and rechecked and then checked again just to pass the time. Maps were pored over, and men milled about nervously, chain-smoking, playing cards, writing letters to friends and family. Anything to bring the time closer, so that they could just get on with it. And the reason I specifically decided to bring up the name of Guy Gibson's dog earlier is because, sadly, on the afternoon of the very day that the operation was due to take place, the squadron's beloved mascot was accidentally run over and killed by a staff car. Gibson was understandably devastated, but he and his superiors immediately took steps to hush the loss of the squadron's mascot up. It was not worth the thought of a bad omen creeping into the collective psyche of the lads, who needed to be 100% focused if this whole caper was to stand any chance of success. The dog was buried at midnight, well after all the planes had left, and most other base staff would be in their beds. Many who have served in conflicts past and present will know the power of a unit mascot, and that black lab was just as much a member of 617 than any pilot or gunner. The Lancasters were fueled and armed, stacking up on the reception roads to the runways, and spun up their engines ready for takeoff. Beginning at 21:28, 617's lumbering beasts hurtled down the runway and took off into the gathering darkness of night. The attack was made up of 3 formations, the first commanded by Gibson, with the call sign G. George, with a further 9 planes that were split down into 3 subgroups of 3, which took off at 10-minute intervals. The others were piloted by Flight Lieutenant John Veer, aka Hoppy Hopgood, who was selected as Gibson's second-in-command and flying the plane M. Mother. Flight Lieutenant Harold Brownlow Morgan, aka Mickey Martin, an Australian serving in the RAF, in P. Popsy. Squadron Leader Henry Young in A. Apple. Flight Lieutenant David Maltby in J. Johnny. Flight Lieutenant Dave Shannon, Royal Australian Air Force, in L. Leather. Squadron Leader Henry Eric Maudsley in Z. Zebra. Flight Lieutenant Bill Astle in B. Baker. And Pilot Officer Les Knight, Royal Australian Air Force, flying N. Nancy. They would go for the Möhne Dam, and then, if there were any remaining bombs amongst them, they would redirect and attack the Eder as well. The second formation was to attack the Sorpe, and consisted of 5 planes, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Joe McCarthy, an American serving in the Royal Canadian Air Force, piloting plane T. Tommy. Although his crew were forced to transfer into a reserve Lancaster when it was found that their original one had developed a leak in their engine coolant system, delaying their takeoff by 34 minutes. Pilot Officer Vernon Byers, Royal Canadian Air Force, in K. King. Flight Lieutenant Norman Barlow, Royal Australian Air Force, in E. Easy. Pilot Officer Jeff Rice in H. Harry. And Flight Lieutenant Les Munro, Royal New Zealand Air Force, flying W. Willie. No childish laughter, please. The second formation actually began taking off first, as they were to take a slightly longer northern route, with the first formation beginning their takeoffs at 21:39. The third formation was a reserve, piloted by Flight Sergeant Cyril Anderson in Y. York, Flight Sergeant Bill Townsend in O. Orange, Flight Sergeant Ken Brown, Royal Canadian Air Force, in F. Freddy, Pilot Officer Warner Otley in C. Charlie, and Pilot Officer Louis Burpee, Royal Canadian Air Force, in S. Sugar. They were to take off 2 hours after the first 2 formations and await further instructions. If the first 2 had no or limited success, the third formation would be ordered in to assist. But if the main mission was deemed a success, they were to peel off and strike 3 other dams that had been identified as potential secondary targets, the Lister, Enepa, and Demel. The planned attack ended up being 2 planes short, as 2 crews had been taken ill, but nevertheless, the show must go on. Rather than be directed from RAF Scampton, the operations room was set up at St Vincent's Hall near Grantham in Lincolnshire. 2 separate flight paths were chosen for the first wave, to avoid the major centres of population and known lookout posts, and both routes were designed so that both formations would cross into mainland Europe at the same time. Gibson's formation flew over the coast of the Netherlands between Schouwen and Walcheren, avoiding the occupied air bases at Eindhoven and Gilserian. And yes, I do not speak Dutch, so I probably butchered those and I apologise. Before skirting around south of the Ruhr Valley's main AA defensive batteries, and then turning again, this time north, to avoid the city of Ham, and then coming about again to fly south to bring them down onto the Möhne River. The second formation's slightly longer flight path took them over the coast at Vlieland and Iselmeer. They then joined the first formation over Wessel, but whilst the first then later peeled off towards the Möhne, the second held their course to head for the Sorpe. All the aircraft flew super low over the occupied lands, as little as 100 feet or 30 meters, to avoid the albeit less advanced but still capable enemy radar sets. However, as you can imagine, such flight paths at low altitude did not come without their problems, and the first casualties of the raid occurred not long after breaching the Dutch coast, leading to the near-total loss of the second formation. A flak battery spotted them and fired on them as they crossed Iselmeer, taking out Flight Lieutenant Munro's radio, forcing them to turn back. The second loss to the attack happened when Pilot Officer Rice flew too low to the water, striking the surface, which ripped away their upkeep bomb, although thankfully not ditching, and so there was no point in them continuing, so they turned about and headed back too. Gibson had almost nearly done the same in his plane, but had just managed to correct before he had lost his bomb. The first total loss of an aircraft came as Flight Lieutenant Barlow's plane was hit by flak and went down into the Waddenzee. followed a little later by Pilot Officer Byer's plane when they collided with a set of electricity pylons coming down near Ries and Haldern. Their upkeep bomb was thrown clear of the crash site, remaining intact, where it would be later captured and examined by the German boffins. This left only Flight Lieutenant McCarthy's crew as the only remaining plane from the second formation to carry on to the Sorpe Dam due to their delayed takeoff. The first formation also suffered a loss when Flight Lieutenant Astel's plane also collided with some electricity wires coming down in a field near the village of Marbeck. However, the rest were all able to carry on and reach the Möhne's artificial lake, where they set up to begin their attack runs. Möhne Dam. Gibson went in first with his plane, his forward gunner doing his best to provide some counter-battery fire to the dam's AA emplacements. Gibson's bomb sadly fell short of the dam and exploded, causing no damage. He was then followed in by Hoppy Hopgood, which had already sustained some flak damage. However, most likely due to the damage and shaking of the plane, Hoppy's aimer hesitated and dropped late. The bomb bounced over the top of the dam and crashed into a power station on the other side, where it then exploded. More AA fire set one of the plane's 4 engines ablaze. Sadly, the late drop and the lost engine meant that Hoppy was struggling to pull up in time. He had gained around 500 feet, but then tragedy, as another burst of flak tore off one of the Lancaster's wings, and so his plane crashed on the other side of the dam, taking all but 2 of her crew with her. Wireless operator Sergeant John Minchin, bomb aimer Flight Sergeant John Fraser, Royal Canadian Air Force, and rear gunner Pilot Officer Anthony Bircher all bailed out, but Minchin didn't survive the drop. Both Bircher and Fraser survived, but were captured. Seeing his second-in-command tumbling to earth, Gibson bravely decided to go back in and draw fire to give the next run by Flight Lieutenant Martin, DFC, a clearer run. However, this drop went awry as the bomb randomly veered off course to the left and hit the side of the dam, causing little damage. As each crew made their pass and had a successful drop, the word "goner" was sent back to the op room via Morse code. Next up came Young in A Apple. Another successful drop, this time remaining on course and once again exploding as intended, but still the Möhne Dam held. Then Maltby swept in and performed another textbook release. This time the cumulative damage was too much, and the Möhne's walls began to crack and fall away under the immense weight of water, millions of gallons suddenly rushing through the newly created gap, obliterating everything in its path on the other side. They had done it. When Gibson saw the dam give way, he instructed his radio operator to send a Morse code message back to base. The word that was pre-selected was the name of Gibson's beloved doggo, which was tapped out, informing Bomber Command back at St. Vincent's Hall that the Möhne part of the mission had been a success. The rest of the Lancasters who still had their bombs now veered away, heading for the Eder, whilst those who had dropped peeled away and headed home, except for Gibson, who stayed on to direct operations. Sorpe Dam. The Sorpe Dam was a different story, however. Its construction was entirely different to the other 2 main targets, being built of long, shallow, angled earthen banks, rather than a bluff concrete wall. It was known from the outset that breaching the Sorpe was highly unlikely, but due to its importance it was decided to give it a try anyway. Due to the many initial losses, only 2 aircraft from the 5 dispatched, one from the 2nd formation and the other from the 3rd, reached the Sorpe, with Pilot Officer Burpee assumed to have been shot down somewhere near Gilsarien, and Flight Sergeant Anderson suffered some damage to his rear gun turret and then becoming lost in the fog, unable to locate the target. On top of this, the attack was not conducted in the same way as the others. Instead of approaching at right angles, the bombs were not to be spun and dropped as the planes passed along the length of the dam. The idea being that the bombs would roll down the side of the embankment into the water and then explode when it reached the right depth. But despite having a delayed takeoff, Flight Lieutenant Joe McCarthy arrived first alone at about 00:15 hours. But the path of the attack run on the Sorpe was made even more difficult, as there was a tall church steeple in the village of Langscheid, which sat on the line of approach, meaning a steeper dive down, with a high patch of ground on the other side, meaning that once the crew went in, they would have to get the line absolutely correct from the get-go, as there would be no time for corrections before release, and then immediately having to pull up to avoid the obstacle. Understandably, with this level of difficulty, McCarthy needed a total of 10 run attempts for them to finally get it just right and the bomb released. However, as McCarthy peeled away, those that were able to looked back to see the fruits of their labour. The bomb had only blown a crater in the top of the dam, but the overall structure of it was still very much intact. A little later, Flight Sergeant Brown arrived on the scene, but by this time, a fog had rolled in and was growing in density, which after 7 failed attempts, led to Brown asking his bomb aimer to drop some small incendiary devices on either side of the dam to act as markers. This they did, and the fires did their trick of lighting the way. The 8th bomb run was a success, but once again, very little damage was caused. The Sorpe Dam would not be breached. Eder Dam. The remnants of Gibson's first formation arrived at the site of the Eder Dam and set up once again for their attack runs. This attack was a far easier affair, as the surrounding topography that the Eder Dam sat in was thought by the Germans that an air attack on this dam would be nigh on impossible, and so was undefended by AA batteries. Whilst it would not be impossible to attack the Eder, the Germans were certainly half right about the difficulty in doing so. Flight Lieutenant Dave Shannon, DFC, was forced to make 6 passes before he decided to pull up and let another go in. Squadron leader Maudsley took Shannon's place and found it equally challenging to set up just right, and couldn't get his bomb away. Shannon came back in for another go, and this time he got it right. The bomb bounced twice before it struck the dam, sank, and exploded just as designed, sending up huge gushes of water as the blast did its work. The dam still stood, but not for much longer. Maudsley had another attempt and successfully released, but his bomb aimer, Pilot Officer John Fuller, for whatever reason, pressed his button a fraction too late. The bomb struck the top of the dam and exploded whilst it was still above the water. The resultant blast damaged Maudsley's Lancaster just as they passed over, but she was still able to carry on. The final Lancaster of the group, commanded by Pilot Officer Les Knight, and managed to get her bomb away perfectly, with the bomb hitting just where it should. The damage from this explosion was the tipping point for the structure, and it gave way, just as the Möhne had. With the Eder now breached as well, Gibson ordered that a second code word be sent back to base, this one, dinghy. Secondary targets. The planes from the 3rd formation were ordered to go after the other dams on the list of reserve targets. Pilot Officer Otley's plane, C. Charlie, headed for the Lister Dam, but was sadly shot down en route with no survivors. That just left Flight Sergeant Townsend and the crew of O Orange, who headed for the Ennepe Dam. He arrived safely and made a successful run at it, but his single bomb was not enough to breach. Although according to some reports it has been suggested that Townsend actually attacked the Bever Dam, with a German eyewitness, a 19-year-old soldier at home on leave named Paul Kaiser, claimed to have seen a bomber making a run at the dam and its bomb causing a large explosion. Several other sources also claim that Townsend had been mistaken on the location, and indeed the 2 dams were only 5 kilometers apart. The body in charge of the dam at that time, the Ennepe Veseverband, were adamant in their claim that there was only 1 bomb dropped near the Ennepe throughout the whole war, and that was a miss, landing in some nearby woodland. Certainly not how a bouncing bomb would be dropped, unless someone really messed up their aim. And Townsend himself complained that when he got back that the map looked nothing like the real location where he was. So it is highly possible that he was mistaken, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it matters all that much. Whilst the Sorpe Dam remained virtually unaffected, the destruction of the Eder and Möhne were more than enough to declare the overall mission a resounding success. They had struck deep into the beating heart of the German war machine, and put a massive dent in their manufacturing, heavy industrial and agricultural capacity. That was no mean feat, and they had accomplished it all in one night. Barnes Wallis, that magnificent bastard, had achieved a feat unthinkable at the start of the war. No doubt congratulatory glasses of scotch were liberally passed all around the operations room, but the night was still not over. 617 had done what they set out to do, but there was still the small formality of getting home. Aftermath. The flight home was sadly not without its problems either. 2 more Lancasters were lost. Squadron leader Maudsley's plane, Z Zebra, was shot down near the Belgian town of Netteden, and squadron leader Young in A Apple was hit as he was crossing back over the beaches just north of Muiden in the Netherlands, crashing into the sea and taking all with her. The first of the 11 surviving bombers began landing back at RAF Scampton at 03:11, and in true leadership fashion, Gibson waited until he thought he was last, bringing his bird down at 04:15. However, he wouldn't actually be the very last, as Townsend returned much later, touching down at 06:15. The crews were greeted warmly by Bomber Harris himself, who congratulated them on a job well done. Despite the long odds, the relief must have been palpable, as well as the melancholic air, that so many did not return. Just after first light on the same morning, a Spitfire modified for photo reconnaissance took off and flew over the sites of the dams to assess the damage. The pilot, Flight Officer Frank Jerry Frey, reported back, quote, "When I was about 150 miles or 240 kilometers from the Möhne Dam, I could see the industrial haze over the Ruhr area and what appeared to be a cloud to the east. On flying closer, I saw what had seemed to be a cloud was the sun shining on the floodwaters. I looked down on the deep valley, which had seemed so peaceful 3 days before, but now it was a wide torrent. The whole valley of the river was inundated, with only patches of high ground and the tops of trees and church steeples showing above the flood. I was overcome by the immensity of it." It was from this flight that we have these photos of the Eder and Möhne, so fresh after the previous night's attacks, clearly showing the effectiveness of Barnes Wallis's innovation. The raid also led to a staggering 34 medals being awarded to various members of the squadron, bestowed by King George VI himself. 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 10 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 4 bars for same. 2 Conspicuous Gallantry Medals and 11 Distinguished Flying Medals and 1 bar for same. For his sheer naked courage under fire and for the successful mission, Wing Commander Guy Gibson, DSO and bar and DFC and bar, was awarded with even more letters after his name. Those 2 most coveted letters in the British Armed Forces. VC, the Victoria Cross, the highest medal for gallantry, and thoroughly well deserved if I may say so. Legacy. Gibson also wrote a book which touched on the raid, entitled Enemy Coast Ahead, which I shall link in the description on Amazon should you wish to give it a read. Sadly, our intrepid hero was later killed on the 19th of September 1944. He had been reassigned to 627 Squadron and was flying a Mosquito fighter bomber. It was not entirely certain why his plane came down, although the consensus appears to be that he ran out of fuel and was forced to ditch somewhere near Mönchengladbach, with him and his navigator, squadron leader James Warwick. Neither man survived the crash. Gibson was 26, Warwick was 22. They are both buried beside each other at Steenbergen in Kruisland Roman Catholic Cemetery in the Netherlands. It is said that the ghost of 617's beloved Black Labrador still roams around RAF Scampton to this day. A handful of stories have emerged about a mysterious black dog that suddenly disappears from sight of those who have claimed to encounter the long-lost pooch. His grave is still honoured and protected at RAF Scampton to this day, albeit his memorial stone has been swapped out for one that doesn't have his name on it. Whilst I don't agree with that, at least his memory and importance to 617 is still being honoured. Another smaller version of the upkeep bouncing bomb was developed for use from a Mosquito fighter bomber. This smaller weapon was codenamed Highball, and instead of using the barrel shape of its larger sibling, was a more spherical shape. Highball was specifically designed as an anti-shipping weapon. There were a few successful tests of this version, with a view to attempting to use it against the battleship Tirpitz while she lay skulking in a Norwegian fjord hide. However, in the finish, Highball was never used in anger, and Tirpitz was eventually sunk by another Barnes-Wallis invention, a 12,000 pound or 5.4 ton tallboy bomb. Originally designed for deep penetration, should have called it the Bonnie Blue, in another endeavour codenamed Operation Catechism on the 12th of November 1944, to use these bombs to sink or at least heavily damage Tirpitz. Who did Bomber Command select for this? Who else but 617 Squadron? It was decided to utilise Tallboy against the battleship because it was felt that even a near miss with such a massive weapon would cause horrendous damage, and they were dead right. Tirpitz suffered a hit that plunged straight through the armoured deck and right out the bottom of her keel. Several near misses dug out craters around the ship that created a space underneath her, which she rolled over into. Tallboy also saw further use during Operation Crossbow of June 1944 that successfully destroyed the foundations of a V-2 rocket production facility. Wallis would go on to invent an even bigger bomb than Tallboy. The so-called Grand Slam was a gargantuan weapon, again designed for deep ground penetration bunker busting, weighing in at a whopping 22,000 pounds or 10 metric tons. This is even overall heavier than the modern child of Wallis's bombs, the USA's model GBU-43/B, dubbed the Moab, which stands for Massive Ordnance Airburst, although military men instead have dubbed it Mother of All Bombs. However, the Moab's explosive filling is around twice that of Grand Slam, due to it being an airburst weapon and therefore not requiring a dense ground-penetrating nose cap. Grand Slams were used against the U-boat pens in Valentin on the Weser River near Bremen. 2 direct hits punched through the stout 4.5-metre thick concrete roof like it was nothing. In all, Operation Chastise was a qualified success. Whilst they did not breach the Sorpe Dam, the destruction of the other 2 still caused significant damage to the surrounding land and sorely dented Germany's manufacturing and agriculture in the region. For example, steel production in the Ruhr Valley was said to have been reduced by as much as 75%, which is a significant hit. Sadly, the Nazis being Nazis, they utilised slave labour for the rebuilding efforts. Both structures were rebuilt and repaired, and still stand to this day. However, for many months afterwards, the floodwaters remained, turning the area into small islands of high ground. But the legacy of the Dambusters raid is one of courage, of, as the Germans would say, Kugeln aus Stahl. The mystique that has grown up around the raid is just as symbolic as its overall results. It proved that Britain could strike the Nazis right at the very heart with weapons that no one else could have ever dreamt of, much less prepare for. This is the everlasting heritage of the RAF in general, and 617 in particular. Interestingly, in 1977, an amendment was made to the Geneva Convention that specifically outlawed the targeting of dams if there is a great chance of significant damage and loss of life to civilian populations, but it does have a caveat that says, quote, "If it is used for other than its normal function, and in regular, significant and direct support of military operations, and if such attack is the only feasible way to terminate such support." 617 Squadron still exists today, although their home is now RAF Marham in Norfolk, and they fly F-35Bs now, still protecting Britain from anyone who would dare threaten her. If you're fixing to fuck around, 617 will make sure you find out. Following the raid, the squadron was retained as a specialist squadron for all the tough jobs. they adopted a new official coat of arms with the French motto Après moi, le déluge, or After me, the flood, which is just as appropriate as it is badass. The last surviving member of the Dam Busters raid, Edward Johnny Johnson, died in 2002. And because it wouldn't be a DID video without a small family connection, one of my distant cousins on my mum's side, Tony Banfield, used to be an RAF test pilot in his younger years, and he finished out his service by regularly flying the Lancaster in the Battle of Britain Memorial flight during the 1980s and early 90s. I had the opportunity to ask Tony about what it was like to fly such a legendary machine, and he replied that whilst it was an immense honour, due to mostly just flying straight and level, it wasn't exactly interesting or exciting from a pilot's perspective, which I suppose coming from a background of a test pilot he'd be used to something a little more adrenaline-inducing, but still very cool though. After the war, the Germans designed a rocket-boosted version of the bouncing bomb that was called the Kurt. It had a rocket engine in the rear that would accelerate the whole device before an explosive mechanism split the spherical warhead from the body, allowing it to race away on its own towards the target, in a much higher speed version of Highball that would allow it to be dropped from a much safer distance for bomber crews. Several of the experimental practice upkeep bombs are on display at various museums around the world, although mostly in the UK and Germany. And, as previously mentioned, the Nanty-Gros Dam still remains and can be visited to this day if you fancy a long hike, and the scale model of the Möhne Dam still exists near Watford. Barnes Neville Wallace was knighted for his service to the nation and went on to the ripe old age of 92, dying on the 30th of October 1979. A true innovative and scientific genius whom I doubt we shall never see the like of ever again. Although hopefully we shall never experience another dire time of need to require such a brilliant mind to drag us out of the mire. There has been a movie made of the raid in 1955, appropriately titled The Dam Busters, which of course contains the epic piece of music, the Dam Busters March, which has become a staple of British patriotism, right up there with the national anthem and Rule Britannia. Being a 1950s film, they are not so worried about the use of the name of Guy Gibson's dog, occurring a total of 14 times, meaning that it could almost be a Tarantino movie. The film is actually really good, with some lovely old-school practical effects, although you'll have to forgive the almost laughable water effect. There has been a long-rumoured remake of the movie mooted for quite some time now that was to be written by National Treasure Stephen Fry, with Christian Rivers slated to direct and Peter Jackson attached as producer as far back as 2008, with the rights of the original being purchased by veteran broadcaster Sir David Frost. Yes, the same one that interviewed Richard Nixon all those years ago. Although, due to modern sensibilities, Stephen Fry has said that he will either avoid the use of the dog's name or even rename him to Digger. Personally, I don't agree with that whatsoever. He had a name, and he was a beloved member of the squadron. He should be respected just like any aircrew. That doesn't mean that it needs to be gratuitous, but history is what it is, and I would have thought of all people, Mr. Fry would know better than to try and obfuscate or outright deny history, but that's just my thoughts on it. Who knows if this film will ever be made? I actually do hope so, regardless of any controversy. We wait with bated breath. A song, written by Mike Harding, named Bomber's Moon, pays tribute to the bomber crews that risk their lives in the name of freedom. It also contains a very poignant anti-war message. Regular viewers may already know where this is going, and yes, I will be closing this video out with my own rendition of this beautifully moving song. So, I shall read out the names of all those brave boys lost during this most daring of raids. We should also keep in our minds the around 1,600 German civilians and forced labourers who sadly fell victim to the floods caused by the breaching of the dams. And after that, I'll leave you with the song, Mike Harding's Bomber's Moon. I shall also leave a link in the description to my source for all the crews who took part in the raid, should you wish to know more on their life stories. And thank you for watching. Lancaster call sign K King. Flight Lieutenant Vernon William Byers, Royal Canadian Air Force, aged 32, skipper. Sergeant Alistair James Taylor, 20, flight engineer. Flight Officer James Herbert Warner, 28, navigator. Sergeant John Wilkinson, 21, wireless operator. Pilot Officer Arthur Neville Whitaker, 33, bomb aimer. Sergeant Charles McAllister Jarvie, 21, forward gunner. Flight Sergeant James McDowell, 20, rear gunner. Easy. Flight Lieutenant Robert Norman George Barlow, DFC, Royal Australian Air Force, 31, skipper. Pilot Officer Samuel Leslie Willis, 31, flight engineer. Flight Officer Philip Sidney Burgess, 20, navigator. Flight Officer Charles Roland Williams, DFC, 34, wireless operator. Pilot Officer Alan Gillespie, DFM, 20, bomb aimer. Flight Officer Harvey Glintz, Royal Canadian Air Force, 20, forward gunner. Sergeant Jack Robert George Liddell, 18, rear gunner. B. Baker. Flight Lieutenant William Astle, DFC, 23, skipper. Sergeant John Kinnear, 21, flight engineer. Pilot Officer Floyd Weil, 24, navigator. Warrant Officer Abram Albert Garshowitz, Royal Canadian Air Force, 22, wireless operator. Flight Officer Donald Hopkinson, 22, bomb aimer. Sergeant Francis Anthony Garbas, Royal Canadian Air Force, 20, forward gunner. Sergeant Richard Bolito, 23, rear gunner. M. Mother. Flight Lieutenant John Veer Hoppy Hopgood, DFC and Bar, 21, skipper and second in command. Sergeant Charles Brennan, Royal Canadian Air Force, 27, flight engineer. Flight Officer Kenneth Earnshaw, 24, navigator. Sergeant John William Minchin, 27, wireless operator. Pilot Officer George Henry Ford Goodwin Gregory, 25, forward gunner. S. Sugar. Pilot Officer Louis Johnston Burpee, DFM, Royal Canadian Air Force, 25, skipper. Sergeant Guy Pegler, 25, flight engineer. Sergeant Thomas J., 20, navigator. Pilot Officer Leonard George Weller, 27, wireless operator. Flight Sergeant James Lamb Arthur, Royal Canadian Air Force, 25, bomb aimer. Sergeant William Charles Arthur Long, 19, forward gunner. Warrant Officer Joseph Gordon Brady, Royal Canadian Air Force, 27, rear gunner. C. Charlie. Pilot Officer Warner Otley, DFC, 21, skipper. Sergeant Roland Marsden, 23, flight engineer. Flight Officer Jack Kenneth Barrett, DFC, 22, navigator. Sergeant John Gutterman, DFM, 22, wireless operator. Flight Sergeant Thomas Barr Johnston, 21, bomb aimer. Sergeant Harry John Strange, 20, forward gunner. Z Zebra. Squadron Leader Henry Eric Maudsley, DFC, 21, Skipper. Sergeant Jack Marriott, DFM, 22, Flight Engineer. Flight Officer Robert Alexander Urquhart, DFC, Royal Canadian Air Force, 23, Navigator. Warrant Officer Alden Preston Cotton, Royal Canadian Air Force, 30, Wireless Operator. Pilot Officer John David Fuller, 23, Bomb Aimer. Flight Officer John Tytherley, 21, Forward Gunner. Sergeant Norman Rupert Burrows, 28, Rear Gunner. A. Apple. Squadron Leader Henry Melvin Young, DFC and Bar, age 27, Skipper. Sergeant David Taylor Horsfall, 23, Flight Engineer. Flight Sergeant Charles Walpole Roberts, 22, Navigator. Sergeant Lawrence William Nichols, 33, Wireless Operator. Flight Officer Vincent Sanford McCausland, Royal Canadian Air Force, 30, Bomb Aimer. Sergeant Gordon Arthur Yeo, 20, Forward Gunner. And Sergeant Wilfred Ibbotson, 23, Rear Gunner. They shall not grow old, as we who are left shall grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. "44 in Bummer County, young men waiting for the night. In the hedgerows birds are singing, calling in the falling light. The captain says tonight will be a bomber's moon. We'll be there and back underneath the bomber's moon. 1,000 bombers over the northern sea, heading out for Germany. Chalky White stands at the dartboard. Curly Thompson writes to his wife. Nobby Clark and Jumbo Johnson are playing cards and smoking fags. And over the hangars rises a bomber's moon, full and clear, rising as the engines croon. Planes they taxi out onto runway 5, sail off out into the silvery night. Sandy Campbell checks his oil gauge. Belgian coast is coming soon. Curly Thompson lifts his sextant, lines up on the bomber's moon. Waves are shining there beneath the bomber's moon. Lancaster's flying high below the bomber's moon. Coming in along the Belgian coast, 1,000 silver shrouded ghosts. Flak flies up around the city. Jumbo Johnson banks his plane, goes in low and drops his payload, turns to join the pack again. People are dying there beneath the bomber's moon. The city's a raging hell below the bomber's moon. Planes head out toward the northern sea. Young men coming home from victory. Over Belgium came the fighters, flying high against the night. Curly Thompson saw them coming, closing in before he died. The young men shot them down below the bomber's moon. Shot them down in flames below the bomber's moon. Young men sending young men to their graves. Saw them down into the North Sea waves. 83 in Bomber County. Mrs. White does the picture and she cries. Chalky White in uniform, looking as he did the day he died. For God's sake, no more bombers' moons. No more young men going out to die too soon. Old men sending young men out to die. Young men dying for a politician's lies. For God's sake, no more bombers' moons. No more young men going out to die too soon. Old men sending young men out to kill. We don't stop them, then they never will. Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please smash the old like button and consider sharing it with a friend to bring even more people into the dark fold. Check out my back catalogue to find even more great videos just like this. I cover all aspects of dark history, so there is sure to be something for you. No doubt this video will probably get nuked by YouTube for use of that word, so I appreciate it so much more if you could binge watch my catalogue to keep them all in the eyesight of the dreaded algorithm to which I am forever a slave. And remember, if you have a YouTube account, make sure you sign in, as you will be able to see the previous videos that have been age restricted, as YouTube won't allow you to see them unless you're signed in, such is the nature of these things. And I would like to extend a massive thank you to everyone who contributed their thoughts to the community post I made in regarding the naming of Guy Gibson's dog. I am glad my intentions were well received, and the outpouring of positive support was very welcome. There were some great points made across the board, both for and against. It was especially interesting to read comments specifically from a couple of black viewers who were in favour of me saying the word, ultimately leading to me making what I think was the right call. Remembering, of course, that, as Uncle Ben sagely told us, with great power comes great responsibility. And whilst it is possible that YouTube could still nuke the video as a result, I think I would rather remain true to the whole ethos behind the channel from the outset of never compromising on the story, and to never shy away from any detail, regardless of the consequences. I certainly never want to be drawn down the same rabbit hole as some other creators, no hate towards them of course, of deliberately obfuscating with terms such as unalived, etc. Anyway, that's that. So once again, thank you everyone for guiding me in my moral dilemma. If you wish to do so, you can support the idea on Patreon, link in the description, or you can become a member right here on YouTube to gain early access to my new videos when they drop. Or if you wish to give a one-off donation, you can do so via the Super Thanks button, and don't forget my merch store if you wish to rep the Dark Legion. And if you would prefer something with a bit more safer work vibe, my alternate channel DID Reads has you covered, with short stories, children's tales, and poetry, all beautifully narrated for your enjoyment. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.